is something that Alexa Miller uses. So she's one of the authors on the Nagshana article, and she talks about how she uses this image when she's teaching medical students. And just as an interesting note, the reason she got interested in doing the kind of thing that she does, teaching medical students from this fine art point of view, is that her sister was misdiagnosed. And her sister has autism. At the time, they eventually came up with the correct diagnosis of Asperger's. Um, but she was originally diagnosed with a mental disorder and it ended up taking, medicine for that, which wasn't useful. Anyway, so that's how she got interested in it. And so she shows this image to students, and you've been looking at it now for a couple of minutes, and you maybe have some ideas of what it is that you think you're seeing there. And this is the kind of thing that she does. So if somebody wants to just like shout out some ideas of what they think they're seeing, that would be great.
Olympic wrestlers.
Okay. Any other ideas?
Somebody picking up somebody else.
Uh-huh.
Looks a little bit pornographic to me.
Okay. Anybody else?
I keep getting like the word entangled.
Maybe like they're fighting or something.
Maybe they're sleeping.
Yeah,
Or
sleeping
sleeping.
opposite
Yeah.
ways on a bed.
Yeah. And so and she talks about how students will sometimes say exactly those things that you all said, right? That they look like they're maybe making love or like they're sleeping. The title of it is The Wrestlers. And so somebody said that. The idea is that if you looked at the title as the diagnosis, right, that you could maybe stop looking to see what else you maybe see, right, or vice versa. Like if you didn't know the title, right? So anyway, the assumptions can lead to a misdiagnosis. That's the main idea there. But getting back to graphic novels, they obviously have a visual element, right? So I wanted to tell you just a little bit more about graphicmedicine.org. So it came from the Graphic Medicine Manifesto pretty recently in 2015. And these are the authors, these 6 people. They're doctors and nurses. Some of them are educators. And you can see too that they have different versions from around the world. So there's Spanish, Japanese, Italian. This was all preceded by, in 2001, Rita Sharon talked about narrative medicine. She's a really amazing woman who in like 1978, I think, became a doctor, an MD, and then about 20 years later got her PhD in English literature. And she now teaches at Columbia University. So she invented narrative medicine. And so I think graphic medicine really has its roots in that idea of narrative medicine. But so graphic novels have this advantage of having both, really. They have that visual element, so you can work on building your diagnostic skills by really studying the images there, but you can also, work on interpreting the narrative. I wanted to share this quote from Sharon from that 2001 article. Along with scientific ability, physicians need the ability to listen to the narratives of the patient, grasp and honor their meanings, and be moved to act on the patient's behalf. This is narrative competence. That is the competence that human beings use to absorb, interpret, and respond to stories. And, even though she's talking about physicians here, I think it applies to anybody who's working with patients or clients, anybody who's involved in diagnosis. So why use graphic novels? Well, I'll get back to what I was just going to say in a second. But so lists have already been compiled. I talked about how graphicmedicine.org is a great website If you go there, there's a search bar. You can put in the disease or disorder that you're maybe, learning about, or you have a patient that has that, and you might be able to find through their website, you might be able to find a graphic novel on that topic. And the NIH has also compiled some. So the image that you're seeing here, this graphic medicine, ill-conceived and well-drawn, it's actually from the National Library of Medicine. So they've done the same thing there. So there's a couple resources online that make it pretty easy to find a graphic novel on a disease or disorder. The other thing that I was just going to say is that analyzing their visual and narrative elements should improve our diagnostic skills. A lot of people have, I think, a sort of visceral negative reaction to graphic novels because they think they're for kids, but they are not necessarily juvenile. Definitely there are some that are juvenile, but those have their merits too, because we work with kids sometimes. And so they can be useful that way. And this is a big one, I know. They don't require as much time as a novel or movie. I say that's a big one because a lot of the people in my cohort feel very busy. I know that they feel extremely busy and probably, can't imagine joining a book club to talk about graphic novels. But an individual graphic novel doesn't take that much time to read. So could take more time if you want to really sit with it and think about it and analyze it, but it's possible to do it pretty quickly. Okay, so that's the why. Now, how can graphic novels be used? They can be used as a tool to learn more about the patient-client perspective. They can be used as a tool to teach, and possibly even as a therapy tool. To give an example of that last idea of using it in therapy, this is an image from Alzheimer's, which is a graphic novel by Dana Walrath, and she says in her foreword to the book that she chose this medium because it's one that someone with dementia could access. She felt like this was something that somebody like her mother could maybe still get something out of and appreciate. Right, and here's an example of how it could be used as a tool to teach. This is one example. So, I talked about how I was finding myself at this intersection of the humanities and allied health, but I really wasn't seeing a lot or hearing a lot about humanities and speech language pathology. This is an exception. There was a professor at Pace University who was teaching an audiology rehab course, and the 22 students in her course had to read El Defo, which is this is a graphic novel for kids. It's, at the library, you're going to find it in the children's section, but can still easily be read by an adult and get something, they can get something out of it. So what this professor had her students do was read the book, and then in groups, they got together and made their own little comic strips. And she and another author, so this is on, it's just briefly written up on graphicmedicine.org. It's not formally written up as an article, but they said there that they some of the results were that they had increased perspective taking, the students did, and greater awareness of their knowledge and beliefs. All right, so I know this is super tiny print, but I did that on purpose to show you just how many graphic novels there are on dementia, because this is all the graphic novels that I could find on dementia. So there's 15 of them, and the highlighted right there shows you that there's an international interest in producing graphic novels on serious topics. So in my article, I talked specifically about tangles. I give an example of how you can do a close reading, and how you can benefit from that as an SLP student like I am. So this is an example of how you can use graphic novels as a tool to learn. And what you have in this novel is, so you have the daughter perspective, Sarah Levitt. So this is a true story. She wrote about her mother's early onset Alzheimer's. And so you get to see her perspective. She did not live with her mother, but would visit, and at that time would be a caregiver. And you get to see, how angry she was as the daughter of someone with Alzheimer's. She was angry at the disease. She said, I was sick of her being sick. And she was angry at, how people responded, how her friends reacted. As you can see in the quote, it's too bad you didn't bother visiting while she was still alive. So you have that perspective. You also have the perspective of the spouse, because she writes about what it was like for her father, who was the full-time caregiver. And then you also get the patient perspective through some direct quotes. I know that with autism right now, the idea is, nothing about us without us, that we should really be listening to autistic voices. It's not really possible to do that with people that have dementia, but we do at least get to see it a little bit through the direct quotes. And so here's really the close reading part of it. I'm sorry the images aren't great. But so the book has 3 parts. And for the most part, they look like your typical, I guess, what you would expect to see if you have any idea what a graphic novel looks like, or imagine a comic strip. And you have a page of, several strips in a row, and each little box is a panel. So these 3 images actually took up a full page. So the panel was the whole page. So that really made them stand out. And so I took these 3 full page panels and kind of looked at them as a series, even though they're not right next to each other in the book. And what you can see is the progression of the disease and how it affected her mother. On the left, the first image that we come across at the end of part 1 is where the mother's frowning and she says, I hate what's happening to me. And then about halfway through the book, at the end of part 2, her daughter said, how's it going, Mom? And she said, oh, I think it's going quite sadly. But she doesn't look quite as sad, right? She's kind of smiling. And then in part 3, the final full page panel that we have, you really see that she has lost language. The daughter's on the phone with her dad and says, how's Mom? And she says that she's just like this. So she can't even really express it anymore. So you see this change in mood. We think of Alzheimer's as this loss of memory, but it also affects how people show emotion, and it eventually ends in a loss of language. So that might make an SLP student think about the research that corresponds with what we're seeing there in the book. And a professor might, be able to put the 2 things side by side, some of the scientific research and the graphic novel. So as an example, this idea of her emotions seeming to change and the facial expression changing, I came across this quote by Lautenbauer and Kuhns. The analysis of the facial expression of pain promises to be one of the most sensitive tools for the detection of pain in patients with moderate to severe forms of dementia who can no longer self-report pain. So again, that idea of the importance of really looking closely and being able to interpret what those looks mean. That's about all I have. That's what I had in the paper. And I just wanted to end by just showing you a few other covers. So another disorder that's treated by SLPs is PPA, or primary progressive aphasia, which if you've heard about Bruce Willis in the news being diagnosed with that, you might have some idea of what that is. This book, Us Two Together, was originally published in Dutch. The image that you're seeing is not cut off. That's what the title actually looks like. And, to represent the idea that this is also something that results in a loss of language. And I think you all can see me in addition to the PowerPoint. So you can see that this is quite a big book, but this takes about, possibly you could read it in about 10 minutes if you wanted. There's just not a lot on each page, but gives a great idea of the horrible devastation that PPA can lead to. But what I like about it too is that it also shows through some direct quotes from her father's journal, that real voice of the patient. I already mentioned Maria and me. This gives the patient perspective. Well, sorry, not the patient perspective, the father's perspective, which, you know, sort of despite the nothing about us without us, I think it's still worthwhile to read a book like this and get the father's perspective to see what the caregiver is going through, and really appreciate that. But this here is interesting for that true patient perspective. This is a book that's got about 40 different contributors, all of them autistic. And so you get a lot of different perspectives on what it's like to have autism. And then finally, I came across this one. I have no idea what this one's like. I just thought it was interesting that, you know, this was written by an SLP. So definitely can be used, graphic novels can be used in therapy. All right, I'm going to stop sharing again. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emily. I don't know if we talked beforehand about preferences for questions right after, or if we hold them for the end. Allison, did you have a plan for that? You have thoughts on that?
I think why don't we save them for the
Okay.
end?
Okay. Well,
Great.
thanks so much, Emily. That was a really interesting talk. I loved hearing. I was curious about just kind of like why graphic novels versus other types of novels. So I was really glad to kind of hear you talk through that. And it's really interesting. I could see how the art pieces in the books you shared was so powerful on top of the content. So thank you. So we'll turn it over to Styck 2.
All right, great. Mariana, if you want to kind of get ready or start sharing your screen, I'll just give kind of a brief introduction. So SIG 2 is Second Language Acquisition and Bilingualism. My name is Mandy Paredes-Tutenberg. I'm a Spanish professor in world languages. And our presentation today is looking at some qualitative work about stakeholders' language ideologies. And our speaker is Mariana Ricklefs.
Okay, thank you so much, Mandy.
Thank you.
Can you all see my slide? Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, I don't know how much time we have for the presentation, so it's already 4 o'clock. So I'll try to be brief. So there's still a third person presenting, right?
Yep, so we're looking
Okay.
about 15 minutes, yeah.
Okay, I'll be
Thank you.
considerate of all of you, your time. Thank you. Okay, so as Mandy said, my name is Mariana Ricklefs, and I'm an assistant professor in the Bilingual Education ESL program in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, College of Education. Oof, that's a lot. That's a lot for an introduction. So I'm continuing here with my slides. Just a little bit about me. I'm not going to read everything, but just a picture of my family. This is when my children were very little. They're taller than me now. So but I like to share, pictures when they were little. And in my office, I also had pictures, when they were babies and things like that. And some of the drawings, colorings when they were young. So anyway, I have a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in ESL, Bilingual Education Literacy. 2 master's degrees. I'm not going to go over that. You can see that on the screen. I consider myself multilingual, and I am pro-multiculturalism. I am not completely multicultural, but I advocate for multiculturalism. Then I came to the United States as a university student, specifically as a Fulbright scholar. I'm a school psychologist by trade in my country of origin in El Salvador. I like to travel. My research interests are pretty much in social justice, equity, racial linguistic ideologies, language ideologies, identity, multilingual learners with disabilities, and interdisciplinary research. So maybe we can work together doing something in the future. I would love that. So the study that I'm going to share with you a little bit, because in a short time, it's about stakeholders, language ideologies, and management. So the purpose was to explore those and how this would influence the education of Latina emerging bilinguals or Spanish, English bilinguals. And here you see the QR code that I acquire for the full text of the article. If you are interested in looking at it later, you can use that RQ. The design, and I'm going to go quickly here, is a historical qualitative case study. And then it took about 10 years, not the work that I did, but the documents, the data that I collected ranged from 2002 to 2012. And here's the citation of that study that has been published recently. The theoretical framework that I used is sociolinguistic. I love sociolinguistics, so this is a sociolinguistic model of language policy by Bernard Epolsky, and I like it because it extends beyond the policy text, the written laws. So in addition to looking at, for example, language policy in the state of Illinois, we can look at what Polsky considered also the social context of language policy and how it is enacted in practice. So according to this model, language policy is essentially a social phenomenon. And we can see it manifested in particular speech communities and how, what are their beliefs, their behaviors, their ideologies, their decisions, and so on, which are also affected in how we work with children in schools. According to this framework, there are three layers of analysis or three interconnected components that you use to analyze data: language practices, language management, and language ideologies. In this particular study, I focus on the last two, management and ideologies. Practices I have used in other studies. So a little bit more about this framework is that according to Spolsky, this language management is not about classroom management techniques. It's not about what teachers do to make sure students are behaving and focused to learn. And it's not about administration styles, leadership styles per se. It's more about the official and more so about the unofficial procedures regarding the language use in the speech community. And this language management is enacted through plans, decisions, efforts to influence others' beliefs and actions. And also what's interesting about this framework is that Polsky says there is a manager, there is a language manager, which could be an individual or a social group with authority over the members of the speech community. So in this case, authority could be self-ascribed, and it relates to white ideology, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, or whiteness ideology, or it could be given by the power of position, right, status. If someone is, for example, the members of the school board, the members of the city council, the school principal, and so on. Then, according to this framework, language ideologies are views, conceptualization, beliefs about the use of language and the speakers. So could be different varieties, or it could be standardized languages. And I use air quotes here for a standard. So there are concomitant possibilities for bias and distortion. And these language ideologies may underlie the decisions that stakeholders make regarding school programs that affect minoritized children. So here we have seminal work from Labov, Lee, Smitherman, and we also have a little more recent work from Bonnie Urcioli. We have Jonathan Rosa, Nelson Flores, and so on, that they extend the view of language ideologies more into racial linguistic ideologies, which I have also used in other research studies. Okay, so this particular study took place in two schools, two elementary schools, and from the same district in this state, in the U.S. Midwest, excuse me. And the communities where the schools were located were mostly white, middle class, and the Spanish English bilingual students were bused to the schools. They were not living in the neighborhood, but this is interesting too, and I'll talk about this later. These are the participants in the study, about 15 stakeholders. They were mostly white, and a few were minority, and most of them females, as it happens a lot in education. And a few of them were bilingual, and a lot of them were the top level of leadership. The language managers, district superintendent, curriculum coordinator, principals, and also documents regarding the comments, the decisions of the school board members. So this is participants, data collection. I'm going with my little bit window here. So how the research question was, how do administrators and teachers' language management and ideologies affect the education of Latinx, Spanish, English, emerging bilinguals, minority students from a school district located in the Midwestern United States? Documents were different types of documents from different sources to ensure a comprehensive data set, and included reports from different sources, also articles from local newspapers from, like I said, 10 years, from 2002 to 2012. This was really interesting too, as we connect text with the social aspect of language policy. Interviews and notes, field notes were also used, and that analysis included thematic analysis using open coding, focused coding, and we are all familiar with qualitative research. So I'm not going to go over that. Then just a little bit, a few examples of themes and sub-themes that emerged from that qualitative analysis, and how this helped me to organize them in what were the language management decisions and what were the underlying language ideologies that impulse the stakeholders to make those decisions. So there are just a few sample comments here. I'm looking at my clock. Here, I think this is very interesting from the school district superintendent in an interview. Verbatim, he said, "We are committed to the internationally based multicultural program at Howard School." That's a pseudonym, and it's the first school. And he's talking a lot about the benefits of this internationally based multicultural program. And then we have here a document from the city council that says that there was a problem in this first school, that it was overcrowded. And then we're going to see what they perceived as the solution. And so I'm going to go over this now about the first school. This is, there's a lot to say, but to summarize a lot, here I have this figure, which is a graphic representation of language management and language ideologies. So the school board members and the district leaders perceive the problem to be as overcrowding in the first school. And they thought that the solution was to send out of that school, out of the multicultural program, the Latino, Spanish, English, bilingual students that were initially part of the multicultural program. And then they also said, well, we don't need Title I. We are not a Title I school. So the other school, Scholars Academy, a pseudonym for the second research site, they do need Title I, so let's send them there. And so it was like saying that we wouldn't miss them. We wouldn't lose anything if we send out all the Latino Spanish speakers out of our multicultural program. And then there are also comments like that, which I don't have time to go over. They would say, we don't miss anything, unfortunately. Then here we have, on the other hand, the minority parents, majority Latino and African-American parents. They would say, we want them to stay. We want the Latino and Spanish speakers to stay at our school, to be part of the multicultural program. They are part of multiculturalism we want to preserve. And then instead they say, let's do other things. Let's do some fundraising so we can create more classrooms. So even though we have this many students, it's not overcrowded and so on. And then the parents also talked about the opportunities for exposure to language diversity and cultural diversity, in addition to the other languages and cultures that were present at the school. They wanted Spanish to be part of it. So this isn't, after so much debate and conflict, the language managers' decisions prevailed, right? The school board members and school districts' decisions prevailed, so the students were sent out. Then about 2 years later, they were in this other school, and I follow up. And then guess what? There were issues again, because the students were not perceived as worthy of quality education. And of course, they would not say this overtly, right? No district leader would say this overtly, but the actions, again, the language management, right? The decisions, the actions, the literacy practices that were supported were a manifestation of this deficit orientation towards minority children. And so we have here, in the case of the principal, he would think of ESL, English as a second language, only as warranted. So some children received it, others did not. It was totally unfair. Then he would say sheltered instruction is given by willing but unqualified teachers. They were not qualified. They had not received any training in ESL and bilingual education and foreign language instruction, but they agree with the principal. So that compatibility in ideologies gave them power over other colleagues. And then we see how power struggles emerged. And there was a lot of lack of cooperation among teachers. The Spanish teacher and the ESL teacher were marginalized. They were not heard. They were not consulted about how to work with the Latino Spanish English bilingual children. So there was a lot of unstable and inadequate teaching for these students. In 1 year, at least it changed 5 times, which is a lot for a school year when you're changing teaching modalities for a group of linguistic minority students. So anyway, there's a lot to say here, but this is just an overview of how much injustice was taking place and how this study helped to uncover all of that injustice, which probably the management leaders or the language managers, were probably aware of. So in conclusions, briefly again, the study showed that there were different challenges and opportunities for these students. Opportunities were minimal in terms of Title I that the second school received, with having all this group of students who were, most of them low income, but not all of them. And then the first school, physically and literally, these students were excluded from opportunity, from equal opportunity, from the multicultural program. The leaders perceived them as undocumented immigrants, even though most of them were not. And they were perceived as they did not belong. And also Spanish was not a desirable language in that community. Unfortunately, this was from the language manager's perspective. And then again, the same group of students is transferred to the second school and problems continue. They did not receive targeted quality instruction. Again, I mentioned the inconsistent implementation of different teaching modalities, teachers who were working with them that were not trained, but they agreed with the principal, so they were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. I mean, it was unbelievable. And then, again, of course, in this environment, there was not really collaboration among teachers. And so much power that the teachers could have to work together for the benefit of the students and the whole school was lost. I like this quote from Henry Giroux. It says, pedagogy is always the outcome of particular struggles, and how the production of school knowledge, values, desires, and social relations are always implicated in power. And pedagogy is always about the specificity of place. And I think of those 2 schools, the research sites, and how power shapes and is reinvented through the prisms of culture, politics, and identity. Recommendations, a little quickly here. We should continue investigating this type of issues. You know, as I consider myself scholar advocate, an activist, right? And I think we need to continue uncovering language ideologies that underlie the school programs, and how language and literacy practices are influenced by these ideologies. We also have to highlight, encourage, and support the work of teachers who are advocates themselves, as it was the case of the Spanish teacher and the ESL teacher in the second school. We also, as teacher educators and as working in institutions of higher education, we need to create opportunities to increase that awareness in our teacher candidates or in our undergraduate and graduate students about how language ideologies are still pervasive in school programs. And also, last but not least, parents and children, minoritized parents and children, we need to include them in our research. They should be empowered to join efforts to interrupt the power of white privilege, as we saw in the language managers. They were all white, middle class. And then we need to make sure parents and children are at the center of our research. They are not subjects to be studied, but they are agents of change. And then here, there's our QR code again in the citation to that study. And if you have any questions, you can email me, mricklefs@niu.edu, and I'll be glad to answer. Thank you so much. Stop share.
Thank you so much, Mariana. This was fantastic. I'm going to share in the chat a link because so much of your work overlaps so nicely with our kickoff event speaker. So if people want to just sort of round out this discussion, and then we will go ahead and pass the torch to SIG 3. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Kara, if you want to go ahead and start working on getting your screen shared, and I will do some introductions for SIG 3. So my name is Dr. Melissa Walter, and I am an assistant professor of human development and family sciences in the College of Health and Human Sciences. And I am the deputy director of SIG 3, which is learning within the disciplines and across the lifespan. So a lot of different topics within SIG 3. But I am thrilled to be able to introduce our SIG 3 speaker today is Dr. Kara Styck, and she is an assistant professor of school psychology. And she's going to talk with us today about teacher perceptions of student social emotional competencies. Turn it over to you, Kara.
All right. Can you guys see that? Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
looks good.
Sorry, I'm not very well versed on sharing screens and Teams. So, okay, awesome. Okay, so I am Dr. Kara Styck. I am a newly minted associate professor in the school psychology program within the Department of Psychology. And my research recently, over the last few years, really since I've come to NIU from University of Texas at San Antonio, has shifted to be really focused on inspecting rater effects on social emotional and behavioral teacher ratings. And I actually wrote a grant with Rachel Gordon, who is now at NIU in an administrative capacity before she was at NIU. And so it's pretty cool that one of my collaborators is now at the same campus. Okay, so let me tell you what all of this means. I'm going to make you do a little work. So I'm going to show a video here. It's a short couple-minute clip, and I want you to observe the boy in the red right here. That's his face is blocked by the red YouTube play button. And I want you to focus on his disruptive behavior in the video, and then I'm going to ask you to rate it.
All right, let's review our American history. Where did the Boston Tea Party occur?
Boston, Massachusetts.
Very good, very good. Okay. Let's see. Who were the Axis powers in World War II?
The Nazis and the Italians.
And?
Oh, yeah, the Americans.
No, they were not part of the Axis.
The Japanese.
Hey, Dan, pay attention. Okay, this is going to be on the test. Very good. Who were the Allies in World War II?
England, France.
Good.
Americans.
Okay. Any more? Any more?
French.
Yeah, we did French.
Oh.
Yes.
Burmese.
No. Think north of us. Hey, Dan! Stop that. Don't be disruptive. Canadian, yes, very good. All right, and what about Vietnam?
There was the Americans and the Jap.
Hey, Dan, sit down. I'm tired of this disruptive behavior.
My grandpa was in the war. Someone that
That was role played, by the way. That was not an actual classroom video.
All right, let's
Oops.
review our American history. Where did the Boston Tea Party occur?
Boston, Massachusetts.
Very good, very good. Okay. Let's see. Who were the
I can't get it to go to the next screen. There we go. Okay. So you've watched the video, you've paid attention to Dan's disruptive behavior. I want you to rate the frequency of Dan's disruptive behavior on this 6-point Likert type scale and keep your rating to yourself. Disruptive behavior is intended to measure the degree to which student behaviors are distracting to others or otherwise interfere with student learning. Examples include calls out, noisy, clowns around, talks to classmates when inappropriate, and out of seat area. In the chat, raise your hand or otherwise let me know if you rated Dan an N, that the behavior never occurred. How about an R, that it rarely occurred? An S, sometimes? Okay. An O, it occurred often. How about a V, very often? And finally, an A. Did anybody rate Dan an A? So what happened? We all watched the same video. We are using the same rating form. Somebody who rated Dan an S, do you mind telling me why or sharing why? How about an O? Someone who rated Dan an O. What was your reason behind it?
Okay, oh, go ahead, Lindsay.
I was going to say it wasn't to the point where the teacher couldn't teach, and maybe could have actually been handled with some different classroom management strategies. So I kept it at a no.
Okay, so part of your response had to do with the student's behavior itself, how it impacted the peers in the classroom, and also how the teacher responded to the student.
Correct.
How about someone who rated an A? What went into that rating? Or somebody else?
I rated a V because it seemed like Dan was engaging in disruptive behavior like almost all the time. So that was kind of, I focused kind of on like the frequency that it occurred. It was maybe not the always, but it was like almost always. So that's why I picked a V.
Okay, so it sounds like you took the definition of disruptive behavior and almost did like a second by second count in your head of like, is this happening? Yes or no? And then tallied that percentage to come up with the rating of a V.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
So y'all came up with ratings according to different internal schemas or operationalizations of what those ratings meant to you. And this, Dan's rating on this direct behavior rating single item scale, it was impacted by both his level of disruptive behavior and also the people who rated him and all of the things that the raters bring to the table when they provide a rating. So this is what I mean by rater effects, that whenever you ask a teacher to provide a rating of a student's social, emotional, or behavioral competency, that score that you obtain is not a pure estimate of that child's behavior. It is an estimate of their behavior plus something to do with item level characteristics, the rating scale itself, and also the rater and what the rater brings to the table. And so rater effects, if you think about it broadly as any variance in the scores or noise that is due to the rater and not the actual student behavior that is being rated. The most common rater effects that have been studied within the literature include severity leniency, which is sometimes called the generosity error. And that simply means that there are some raters that tend to rate low across the board when compared to other raters, and some raters that tend to rate high across the board when compared to other raters. Halo horns effects mean that there are some raters that will answer all of the items based on maybe their response to a single item. And sometimes that is a halo effect where all of the behaviors are rated high as a result of this one characteristic behavior of disruptive behavior, or like a horns effect where the one characteristic stands out and is used to rate all of the items, even though that might not necessarily be a true representation of the child's behavior. Finally, restriction of range effects occur, and these are when only part of the rating scale is actually used. So perhaps everybody rates on the very high end, a V or an A, or everybody rates on the very low end, an N or an S, and very infrequently are other points of the rating scale actually used. Central tendency is a special case of this, where the range is specifically restricted to the middle, where somebody might apply middle ratings across the board, regardless of actual variation in the levels of the behavior. There's other effects, like inaccuracy. You can look at how a rating compares to some external criteria. There are rater biases, so perhaps rater effects aren't fixed, but they change depending on what items the person is using for the rating or what students are being rated. There could be influences from the rater or the ratee's background characteristics, recency primacy effects, order effects. So these are certainly not the only ones, but severity leniency is the main rater effect that I study. And as a result of studying severity leniency, I can also look into halo horns and restriction of range types of effects. Why is this important? Well, I would tell you that this is important because social, emotional, and behavioral competencies are almost exclusively assessed in schools through some type of teacher rating. What y'all did was a direct behavior rating single item scale, where a teacher is asked to observe a student for a certain period of time, typically about 10 minutes, and then they provide a rating for the student at the end of that period. Sometimes the direct behavior ratings have multiple items, where you might rate them on out of seat area and then talking when they're not supposed to talk, and like other items. You could have your run-of-the-mill teacher rating scales where you have a series of maybe 30 or 40 questions, and the teacher is asked to think back in the past 2 weeks and rate the student's behavior based on their memory. And regardless of which format these teacher ratings come in, they all are prone to rater effects. So we have studied this in my lab, and instead of talk through a single study, there's a lot of things that we have ongoing, and I thought I would talk through kind of our top 5 most interesting to me findings that we have discovered as a result of looking at this. So regardless of what behavioral competency we're talking about or what format the ratings are collected in or who is being asked to rate, we have found that there are significant differences in how people rate in terms of their severity leniency, always, without question. And that these differences are quite large for some kids and small for other kids. And so when you look at the aggregate effect of how these scores might relate to external criteria, it doesn't appear to be a huge impact, but there are certain kids where their score and the score they would obtain if it was calibrated to the severity leniency level of the rater are very, very far apart. The second interesting finding is that a rater's level of severity leniency is not stable across rated domains. So we've compared raters' ratings of the same group of kids on, for example, social skills and disruptive behavior, and the person who is the most severe for social skills is not necessarily the person who's most severe on disruptive behavior. And the rank ordering is not highly correlated across domain areas. So this severity leniency effect appears to be influenced in part by the actual domain that raters are being tasked with rating. We also have found that a rater's level of severity leniency isn't stable over time. So just because you tend to rate severe on time 1 does not necessarily mean that a week later you are going to also be severe at time 2. And we have inspected this with videos. So these are classroom videos where we don't change anything about the video. So you're literally seeing the exact same video more than once and being asked to rate the same kids on more than one occasion with that same video. So nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is the rater's level of severity leniency. We've also found that the way that raters use a rating scale differs across raters and items. And so what I mean by that is there is some internal ruler that you are using to calibrate your ratings. There is something that you see that makes you change from a never to a sometimes, or an often to an always. And what that thing is and where that tick mark is on the ruler is not the same for you versus another rater. So the severity of the behavior that is required in order for an increased rating to occur is not the same. So the tick marks are not placed in the same spot from rater to rater. We've also found that they're not necessarily in the same spot for a single rater on different items. So when you're rating one item on a rating scale that's meant to measure social skills versus rating another item on a rating scale that's meant to measure social skills, that ruler's tick marks also change. And then what we lovingly refer to as the chaos model in my lab is you can cross both of those factors, where we have found that that model actually fits best for some rating scales and on some specific domain areas of behavior, where not only do raters, their internal ruler is different from other internal rulers of other raters, but the tick marks are different for the same rater in different items. So every item and every rater has a different ruler. This is obviously problematic because then the end scores don't mean the same thing for one rater versus another, or even are meaningful for a single rater because the rulers are different for different items. The final thing that has come from one of my doctoral students' theses and dissertation research is we've started looking in specific rater training to see if rater training can mitigate rater effects. And then we've also compared it against statistical calibration to see if rater training is better than statistical calibration. And we've collected longitudinal data, and the first data point showed that training did actually outperform statistical calibration. Statistical calibration still improved the scores, but not to the extent that rater training did. And what we are going to do as a follow-up is take a look at the longitudinal data at time 2 to see if the training effects lasted 2 weeks later. And if they didn't, then that tells us that maybe statistical adjustment might be better, because it's something that you can do and not have to come back to, or it'll give us a sense of how long rater training, the effects of rater training last. So kind of some future directions, things that we have in the works. We are very interested in what item and scale characteristics might cue rater effects. So if we can figure out if there's some words that tend to evoke rater effects more than others, or certain phrases, we can avoid those. If there are certain numbers of scale points that tend to evoke more rater effects versus others, we can make sure that rating scales have the optimal number of points. Anchors are also important. So what is the actual verbiage that's attached to those Likert scale points? And does that somehow evoke rater effects? And then we're also interested in rater characteristics. So what are the things that the rater brings to the table that might make them more likely to rate in a way that's different than other raters in a systematic way? And so things like stress level for teachers. If a teacher is rating disruptive behavior of students and they have a high level of stress, then they might not manage their classroom very effectively, which is going to result in increased disruptive behavior problems, negative relationships between teachers and students, and it might impact their ratings. Background knowledge is another piece of information that could be related to the rater. So if there are certain raters that have certain key pieces of information about a rated domain, or even background knowledge about a student that might impact the way that they approach a rating. We are interested in how long the effects of rater training last, like I just mentioned, and trying to see what's the best way to mitigate rater effects. And by best way, we really do mean feasible as well, because these models are fairly complex, and chances are there's not going to be a tiny person in every school district performing advanced statistical models. And so we're also exploring different ways to build this into the scoring software of commercially available rating scales. So if there's some way that we can estimate a rater's level of severity leniency before they fill out a rating scale, then we can use that information to calibrate their ratings. And then finally, we're interested in scale development. So if we know that there are certain item level characteristics and rater characteristics that are likely to produce or evoke rater effects, then can we build scales that are optimal in terms of not evoking rater effects? And then can we make them better and tied to the local context so that they are appropriate for use with the kids that they are actually being evaluated? So lots of big stuff. And that is all I have.
All right, thank you so much, Kara. That your work is so important for all of the applied research that we do, but then also within practice, knowing that so many decisions are made for children in particular based on how these rating scales are completed. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
And I will turn it back over to Allison, if you want to close us out.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming. I don't know if Emma is prepared to announce our swag recipients.
Yeah. Let me share real quick.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you so much for sticking around too on a Friday afternoon. Hopefully everyone is yes, thank you, Mandy. Please complete the attendance survey. not related to the raffle, just we as a center on NIU's campus have to track attendance at our events so that we can justify to NIU that we are worth having on campus. So if you would, it's really important if you would please fill that out. Thank you. All right, go ahead, Emma.
All right, here we go. That seemed like a very anticlimactic spin, but it looks like Gracie is our winner. Congrats. Gracie.
Woohoo! Congrats,
I will
Gracie.
message you and you can pick whoever.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great weekend and be on the lookout for future CISLL events. Thank you. Thanks to all our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.